Guys, this is Josh Ellis. He is my counterpart in Houston, and he's my friend as much as my colleague in ministry. But God has his hand on this young man, and they're learning. I mean, I'm certainly not going to portray Josh as the guy who has all the answers, but they're a couple of years further down the line and learning some things, especially with the North American Mission Board Replant. So I've asked Josh to share with us about revitalization and replanting, some of the story of what they're doing in UBA that may help our thinking as we look to help our churches here. So with that, Josh, I'll turn it over to you. And again, thanks for sharing with us.
Sure. Yeah, I don't know that I have, I've been wrestling with, I'm not really comfortable like lecturing on this topic. And so I'm much more comfortable just kind of dialoguing and bouncing ideas. But when you sent me the topic of making disciples through revitalization and replanting, for us, that is really why we turned our energies toward what we call church renewal. And so we have three main priorities that we as a staff pour our energies into. I mean, in association work, you react to everything under the sun. I spent an inordinate amount of time in the last week talking to churches about dissolution clauses, which is insane, but that's just the way it goes sometimes. So for us, when we do proactive work, we talk about sending pathways, which is our initiative to get churches to consider health from a perspective of, are you preparing people within your congregation to answer the call to do gospel tasks, whether that is pastoring, missionary work, maybe yourself, you're being called to be a replanter. Maybe it is to be working with diaspora people groups, whatever it is. But we work on the fundamental principle that you have people in your congregation being called out to do things. I was called out from a local congregation. I'm willing to bet you all were too. And so that's just a fundamental principle. Churches need to be sending. So sending pathways is one. Church renewal is kind of the flip side of that. We have a number of churches in our association, and always do, where they're not healthy enough to send out. And so if they're not healthy enough to send out, we want to get them there. And so church renewal, and it encompasses revitalization and replanting, because we don't approach every situation the same. And actually in church renewal, everything is customized. Sending pathways is a little bit more cookie cutter. We have a pathway for helping churches develop missionaries. We have a pathway to help churches develop replanters, traditional pastors, diaspora missionaries. In church renewal, everything is customized. And so we do a lot of this in Hispanic churches. We do it in a little bit different way in African-American churches. We do it a little bit different way in Anglo churches. But we do all of that. And then our third initiative is collaborative care, which is where we get not only pastors to know one another and be known, but we try and bring different staff members from different churches together. We try and get members of different churches to know one another. But that's kind of the undergirding of the foundation. The association is, the team doesn't function well if the team is not healthy. And so everything for me usually revolves around sports analogies or military analogies. And so this is one big team sports analogy for me. But, at our core, we are a collaborative network of churches strategically advancing the gospel of Jesus Christ. Everything for us revolves around the Great Commission. And everything for us, and I say this all the time, revolves around kind of this foundational conviction that churches cannot accomplish the Great Commission by themselves. They cannot work their street corner. They cannot work their 2-mile radius, keep their head down, focus intently on their 2-mile radius, ignore everything else around them, and everybody end up at the Great Commission being accomplished. If it worked that way, we'd be done by now. There are too many really good churches around. There are too many really good ministries around for it not to have been accomplished by now, if that was a good principle. But the statistics don't lie. reality doesn't lie. If everybody could just stay in their lane and everybody end up at the finish line, we'd be done by now. And so, everything that we do proactively has a collaborative flavor to it. And revitalization and replanting is no different. Now, how we talk about revitalization replanting is a little bit different because we have yet to encounter a revitalization or a replant situation that doesn't require a multitude of partners. Now, we also have yet to encounter a revitalization or replant situation that isn't the result of a church working themselves into a nosedive, also in isolation. We just don't encounter churches in these nosedive situations that are well connected to other pastors, that are active in the association. We see declining churches, we see plateauing churches. That's for sure. But when we're talking about replant situations in particular, when we see revitalization situations, they call us when they can't pay the light bill anymore. They call us when we haven't heard from them in 10 years. And so that sometimes is an opportunity for us to go in and start those conversations. Sometimes it comes as a result of a pastor retiring or leaving. I think we're getting ready to start a new replant conversation with a church because the pastor resigned with no notice. And in that particular case, we knew the pastor. We knew the pastor really well. We didn't know the congregation really well. And so we were actually working with him on some revitalization strategies. He was calling everybody. He was calling us. He was calling the state convention. He was calling Tom Rayner. He was calling everybody, and he was trying just droplets of everything that everybody suggested. And all the while, things were just mounting on him. And then he just broke one day and called us and said, "Hey, I resigned last week, so I don't need your help anymore. I could use some advice about where to go to church." I'm like, "Oh, okay, that's different. So I guess we'll try and make contact with somebody in your church and take it from there." So, so there's that. And then there's the church of 11 people that I'm working with, that I'll give them a report, not this coming Sunday. Thank goodness we didn't schedule that on Mother's Day, but the Sunday after that, where I will maybe make it out alive after giving them the report. But I'm basically recommending that they completely start over. Like, everybody in any position at all resign. The pastor is planning on retiring that day anyway. It was his idea to start the consultation, and it was his idea that I deliver this report. He's 89 years old and has early onset dementia. He, his family, and his doctors all want him to retire. And so whether they accept the report or not, he's already told them he's done. He's been with them 3 years. Of the 11 people, 3 people are basically controlling the process, and may be up to some not good things. We don't have conclusive proof on that, but I'm giving them 6 recommendations. And one of them is everybody in every leadership position resign. We'll put in a new leadership team. 3 people recommended by the association, 2 people voted on by the church. And we will start everything over again. I don't expect them to approve the report. I expect them to usher me to my car quickly. And then we'll see. But they're already in a position where they can't pay the light bill. So we'll see. And like I said, they run 11 people. So they contacted the association 3 years ago when they were running 35 people, and they didn't like what we said back then either. So it's not always, when Jim initially contacted me, he said, "Give us some encouraging words." And I was like, "Sure, I can do that. And I can also scare the dickens out of you." So, replant revitalization is a little bit of both. I can give you success stories. We have some great success stories. My favorite story to tell actually came out of the wake of Hurricane Harvey. And we were driving around checking on our churches. Finding churches wasn't easy. I don't have to tell you all that. And I was driving around Pasadena, and I was driving past a church that we did not have contact with at all. And I saw an older gentleman outside of one of our churches, and I just stopped on a lark. And I pulled up next to him and I said, "Sir, how you doing?" And he asked me who I was. And I said, "Well, I'm Josh Ellis with the association." And he said, "I love the association." And I thought, oh, I have found my people. He knows what the association is. This is fantastic. And it turns out he was I think he was 85-year-old. I think he was a treasurer, a deacon. He was also the building maintenance guy at the time. And so he knew all about the association. He's telling me stories about the association. And he started telling me about the church. They're running, a couple dozen people, had a part-time pastor who had been there for years, still faithfully serving, and walked me through the church, which was in dismal shape before Harvey, and then Harvey kind of wiped out the building. And, to make a really long story shorter, we said, what we're probably going to recommend is that this is the end of the road for this church. About that same time, we had a church plant coming from North Channel, looking to be in the Pasadena area. Said, "Do you know of a place that would just let us be in their space?" And we honestly said, "Yes, but you're probably not going to want to be there." And they said, "Man, we're just a church of a bunch of blue collar, do it yourself guys. Let us see it." And so we connected those two. They fell in love with the place. They fell in love with the people. They fell in love with the part-time pastor. And so we ended up brokering that relationship. They ended up employing the part-time pastor before the church, the older church dissolved. They ended up they were actually staying in business because the pastor lived in the parsonage and the church owned the parsonage. So we negotiated a deal where they sold the parsonage to him for $1. The new church that was coming in did everything right. They honored the old church. They actually even named the new church. It's now called Juncture Church at Queens Road instead of Queens Road Baptist Church. The two congregations merged. The old members actually joined the new church. They've been baptizing. They have a thriving Hispanic ministry now. It's the home run on top of the grand slam, on top of the touchdown, on top of the hole in one. It was a fantastic story. And for the first couple of years, we didn't even like telling the story because it made replanting look easy. Because I think in 3 conversations, the whole thing was done. And so, we used to tell people, look, we're going to tell you this story. This is not going to ever happen again. In fact, we had 2 replants later. We had 2 of my church consultants end up in court. They were, on the side of the church people that wanted to do a replant. They were being sued by somebody who didn't want to. The whole thing got really, really ugly. And now the person who won is preaching to 3 people in some property down on the southwest side of Houston. And so it doesn't always go well. But I can tell you more success stories than I can dumpster fires. And I can tell you that it has been an exciting prospect for our association because it is something that our small churches and our big churches can work on together, which sounds like associational fantasy, but it's really not. We replanted a church also in the Pasadena area, and took it from being an Anglo congregation to a Hispanic congregation. It was Broadway Baptist Temple. Now it has a Spanish name, and it's actually the subject of a YouTube video. And I sent Jim the link to that YouTube video. It's a great story. In fact, when they started working on the outside of the church, they took down the chain link fence that the Anglo church had around it. And one of the community residents who works at the car wash across the street came across the street and said, "Oh, are you opening the church back up?" And he said, "Well, it's been open the whole time." He goes, "Really? I thought it was closed." And they're like, "No, it's been open the whole time." But they had over 100 people this past Easter. They've been baptizing. and it took a variety of partners. It took not only a vibrant Hispanic congregation, which was meeting in one of our other churches, but had outgrown that space. We moved them in there, but it took going to some of our larger churches saying, hey, we're going to need help. This building needs a ton of help. And so we had several churches. First Baptist Pasadena is the one that comes right to mind, but we had a couple of others. They drove over and they got so involved, they started doing things that we didn't ask them for. They were working on the roof and doing some drywall stuff. And the next thing you know, one of them disappears and shows back up with a trailer full of sod and says, man, we need a yard. I mean, this is just, we need a yard. And so what that does is it builds momentum, because then they start saying, well, where's the next one? You know, and now we're kind of like, well, actually we have a list here. And so the momentum has built so much for us that frankly, we're actually kind of saturated with it. I mean, I'm working 2 or 3 processes right now. Victor, one of my Hispanic consultants is working, I think 6. Keelan is working 2 or 3, and these are not light duty assignments. Keelan and Victor worked one that went more than a year. The last one that I worked more than a year. These are intensive work, and that's not just recruiting the partner, but that's walking alongside the church, reviewing all of their core documents, sitting with people, listening to them, working with the leaders that are in place. Sometimes the pastor is there. Sometimes it's an intentional interim. Sometimes it's not an intentional interim. It's just an interim. And so we have, initially, it was entirely staff driven from the association perspective. And then we had to broaden our team out so that we could duplicate our efforts. And so we enlisted a team of pastors to come alongside us that we trained to say, hey, you ride shotgun with me and watch this. And then we can duplicate our efforts. And so we've actually had a couple of replants. These were more revitalizations that were not, that didn't involve staff at all. We've had a couple of transfer of properties, which are great stories. And we tend not to do a ton of that. We're one of in fact, every time I'm on a call with my peers, we hear about associations receiving properties from churches. We actually don't do a lot of that. We don't have any church properties in our name right now. I take that back. One, it's a BSM building. But other than that, we don't have any properties in our name. And my foundation board is very hesitant to get into that game. I'm probably the most on board of anybody in the association, and I'm wildly outgunned. So, we don't do a lot of that. The last church that folded and wanted to give us the building, we brokered the transfer of that to a Hispanic congregation that will be working in an active partnership. We're not calling it a rental agreement. They're not calling it a tenant agreement. It's an active partnership with an African-American congregation. And it's going to be great, but it's going to require other partnerships. And so we're enlisting some other churches to help them with some facility, and there'll actually be 3 congregations because there's a Cambodian congregation there as well. So we love the team building aspect of this. And the other thing that this effort has allowed us to do is to go back to our bigger churches, which we have a good relationship with, and say, look, we have talked about the Great Commission. We have talked about how that is the focus of our association, making disciples. And let's be honest about our city. So Houston is very much a city that is segregated. It is divided along economic lines. It's divided along racial lines. I mean, it's known for being the most diverse city in the United States. That is a wonky statistic, and I'm the stats guy and I'm the demographics guy, so I can own that. That our pastors love to quote that statistic. They're actually quoting the Neighborhood Diversity Index. They just don't know it, and they're actually globbing onto Fort Bend County, even though they don't know that either. So it is what it is. We're incredibly diverse. I'm not going to take that away from us, but when you look at Houston and where you look at where we are planting churches, we plant churches in the suburbs for the most part, and along what I call the income arrow, which is an arrow that points from Katy to downtown. And then I call it the arrow because it's got a little offshoot going from downtown to the northwest and from downtown to the southwest. That goes right through Bel Air and then northwest up through the Heights. If you look at any income map, that's where the money is. So it's all along the suburbs, and then in that arrow, that's where we plant churches. Not coincidentally, that's where Anglos are congregated most densely. That's where the highest performing schools are. That's where all the good things are in Houston for the most part. If you look at even land value, if you look at percentage of land being used for environmental purposes, you have the best quality land inside that. All of the correlations are there. And I said, look, gang, I gathered probably 20 or 30 of our largest churches, our most missional churches. And I said, okay, I'm going to show you all these maps, some the city produced and some I produced. I said, now I'm going to show you where we planted churches in the last 10 years. And bam, the correlation was there. And you felt the air just leave the room. And so I've started using this vernacular of forests and deserts. We have created forests in Houston, and forests are great for planting trees, right? You just walk through, you drop a seed, it takes care of itself because the soil is ready, right? I mean, that's going to be easy. A tree is going to pop up there. But if you want to reclaim the desert, you have to be intentional about it. If you want to reclaim the desert, you have to be not just intentional, but you have to be innovative about it. You're going to have to use different means. You're going to have to be a lot more innovative and a lot more collaborative. And so where we are revitalizing and replanting churches, they're nowhere near the forests. Okay. We have very marked desert areas in Houston, and all of our struggling churches tend to be in those areas. And so now that I have kind of put that in front of our best churches, they know that vernacular is there. They know that truth is there. It's not arguable. And so, yes, there's enough lost people to go around. We've batted that around. The statistics are there. I'm not against church planting, and they're going to keep doing that, and we're going to keep doing that. We're going to keep helping them do that. But we're always going to keep putting church renewal in front of that. Sending pathways and church renewal works together. It doesn't work against each other. So if we're going to be serious about gospel saturation, if we're going to be serious about making disciples, we have to do both. And our best churches know that they have to do both. They have to be serious about church planting. They have to be serious about pushing the edges of the frontier out. They also have to be serious about leaving no one behind. I'm a big leave no one behind guy. And that's a shift, frankly, in associational life. There was a time, so I've worked at UBA now for 16 years. When I first came to the association, it was very common, and not just UBA, but for most associations, to talk about churches in terms of islands of health and strength. That was a church consulting term. That term referred to pouring your energies into churches that were getting the job done and doing it really, really well. That's where you wanted to focus your energies, because that's where your energies were most likely to be multiplied. You didn't spend a lot of energy in the dying churches and the declining churches because they were seen as you're going to be sucking your resources dry. You're going to be spending a lot of times in a dry hole, to use the drilling term. But now, especially with NAM focusing on replanting, with associations focusing on replanting, that cycle has kind of reversed, or maybe at least evened out. And I think that's right. I think we shouldn't be leaving people behind. I also think the reality is going to catch us one way or the other. I spend a lot of time talking to our association about gospel footprints. We cannot afford, as the body of Christ, to be giving up gospel footprints throughout our city or our county, where we have spent Baptist resources and where people have gone before on missionary journeys, to lay out land, to lay out demarcations of the gospel. Why would we say to them and their legacy, yeah, that doesn't matter anymore? And so now we got to be strategic about it, right? I mean, in good Baptist fashion, somebody went and claimed that street corner, and then 20 years later it split, and now they own the street corner across the street. we probably don't need both. But let's be strategic about it. Let's claim at least one of them, and let's not give up that ground. And so I'm a stickler for going after the churches that have not been active in the association. I can't win them all. I can't get them all back, but and this is coming from a guy who culled his role first year after being in the executive director chair. So we went from having almost 600 churches on the roll to having less than 400 churches on the roll. And that's because I dropped everybody who hadn't given or talked to us in more than 10 years. Again, those two things might seem counterproductive to each other, but they're really not. I want people on the team who are looking to get the ball. I want to distinguish players on the field from people wearing replica jerseys in the stands. And so we're very serious in UBA about reclaiming the desert. We're very serious about involving all of our churches in that effort. And I think the churches that are taking part in that are excited about it. You know, our mega churches are excited about seeing gospel works afresh. And we also have the benefit of, this is not new information to a lot of our mega churches. Harvey Kneisel at Houston's First Baptist, who just recently passed away, this was part of his legacy. He did it a little bit different than we're doing it. But essentially the effort is the same. Help out struggling churches, get them to a point of health, get them back on their feet, get them back to being gospel-centered and Great Commission focused. And that's what we're doing too. So anyway, that was a lot of lecturing for a guy who didn't really want to lecture, but that's kind of what we're doing. You know, any questions or thoughts that you have, I would welcome them.
Yeah, Josh, let me ask a couple. Of course, I just recently did the NAM Replant Lab. I'm in the middle of working with one potential replant now, church in the center of our Hispanic, typical transitional community story. And we have examples of almost everything that you described there. But again, we're primarily a single staff association. I've got a part-time Hispanic guy who's a full-time pastor at his church. I've got my daughter, my ministry assistant, because she works cheap. and so, but my best hands for multiplying it are also the busiest people in their churches. So how did you transition from being staff-led in your replant renewal effort to building a team and having these guys see the value in making that investment?
The first people that we went to were our really, really quality retired pastors. So the first three guys that we enlisted are the guys that are on my short list for interim pastorates, because they had already done kind of revitalization in one way or another. And I knew that they were going to be getting calls from these churches anyway. So we brought them in, and they were not, like, none of them have been to the NAM Replant Lab. Keelan and I kind of gave them the short version of the NAM Replant Lab, since he and I both teach it. But we basically said, look, this is first of all, the distinction between a revitalization and a replant is important. A revitalization, you have the resources basically in-house. You need a little outside help. You need some coaching. You need probably some partners. But revitalization means, given with time, you have enough in-house to pull the plane up out of the nosedive. A replant basically means, if the plane hasn't crashed yet, you're 3 feet off the ground. You don't have the resources within. You need to basically take what has happened in the crash, put it in a new pot, replant it, and start over. And so I took my highest quality interims, who basically, you know, they had 30 years of pastoring already under their belt. And this was, let's give them some new tools and say, okay, this is how we would refashion it. And then they rode shotgun with us along the process too. And I invited two guys who had already replanted a church to be on that team as well. Now, all cards on the table. The replanter so Junction Church at Queens Road, we invited him to be a part, Ken Durham, and he works primarily his model. And so we kind of a quasi partnership there. We work together with him. He's fantastic. We work with our interim pastors, and we work very close consultations with them. And then, so we added, I think, basically 4 people to the team of our staff that work most of the models. And then our Hispanic consultant has 2 or 3, maybe 4 Hispanic pastors that work with him in those environments. And then we're developing 2 or 3 Anglos to also, because their church has been replanted and they are actively part of it. And so now they are riding shotgun with Keelan as he goes on to do the next ones. So we're taking those success stories and we're adding them to the process as we move forward.
Good. Very good. Appreciate that. I was very excited to hear the story. You mentioned Broadway Temple. That was my first full-time pastorate while I was at seminary there in Houston.
It's never gotten over it. It doesn't sound like that.
Yeah. There are some stories, but they put up the fence in the following pastorate after mine, and it was heartbreaking to see that. And then as we've driven by and seen more of the property whittled away, the parsonage we lived in gone. Of course, it needed to go. It was in poor repair 30 years ago. But the last couple of times we've driven by there, I've wanted to catch them on a Sunday and just worship with whoever was there to see what was going on. So I'm excited to see the video and see the story there.
Yeah, it's really cool.
So have you seen an Anglo church effectively anywhere minister and bring in Hispanic neighborhood? Have you seen an Anglo church inside of a Hispanic neighborhood make that transition?
Without themselves becoming a Hispanic church?
Oh, I don't know if I want to add that caveat, but just yeah, I mean, yeah, yes.
So
not many.
Yeah, I'm scratching my brain. We have several churches in Houston that have thriving Hispanic ministries where both the Anglo side and the Hispanic side are doing well. I haven't seen an Anglo replant do a replant in a Hispanic neighborhood without it becoming a Hispanic church. But in all honesty, we've never tried it either. Most often, like in the case of Broadway Baptist Temple, the neighborhood was 90% or more Hispanic, and it didn't call for an Anglo presence there. It called for a Hispanic church there.
Right.
Yeah. When we were there, it was probably even then 75% Hispanic, some African American. We're running about 30, 35 Anglo with about 20% English speaking, second or third generation Hispanic. And we merged with the Spanish mission of Sagemont. And so they brought their whole group over, bilingual services. But not long after I left, that pastor left and completely lost track. But whatever track we were on there, with leadership change, vision changes. And but even so, it was very distinct Anglo, because the group we shepherded, they were who they were. And ultimately it was only when they brought the Hispanic really personality of the church were they able to reach some of those folks.
So when you go into those churches, then you tell them, we need to bring in a Hispanic pastor. And do you help them do that?
I do. Yeah. Those always require the presence of one of my Hispanic consultants or a couple of my Hispanic pastors. We help make that transition. that's never a fun conversation. But the demographics in those situations don't lie. I mean, like the one that I'm working with now, that they're not going to be happy with me. What I said to the leadership team was, if you were planting a church, you would not put an Anglo church here. It's in every census tract around that church, it's at least 66% Hispanic and 20% African American, and whatever is left is a mix between Anglo and Asian. No church planter in their right mind says, well, let's put an Anglo church there. So in almost every circumstance, an Anglo church that is there is trying to minister to the remnant. And most of the time, people are driving in to there to go to church. They're driving 20 or 30 minutes to go. And you can't honestly say we're gonna impact the community, especially if there's a language barrier. And so then you have to be real honest and say, are we going to be able to make disciples in this location? Because if we're not going to be able to make disciples in this location, then why are you there?
That's kind of the circumstance with the replant that we're working. We have Central City Baptist Church, historic Anglo church, and their last pastor was bilingual. And so they actually had a sense of a bilingual flavor. He quit right before COVID. And then I preached their last service before their COVID shutdown. When he left, all their Spanish speakers left. So they're down to 5 folks, an African-American woman, an African-American man, and 2 second-generation Hispanics who've been in Anglo churches all their lives, and an 89-year-old Anglo woman. And so they're ready to replant. They're engaging with us, casting a vision for our churches with resources to invest in that is something we're kind of in the midst of now, for them to see the value of that.
Sure.
But I would love to come by and visit with you and Victor and get your feedback, or even bring you guys here to help me survey that, because the school across the street, 85% of those kids speak Spanish at home.
Mm.
And so, you've got an area that the challenge that we talked about in our last board meeting was that with these properties, and again, I love your, the footprint and losing those gospel points. If we abandon those properties, they become a blight in the community. What responsibility do we have to give every effort to reclaim those as a center of gospel witness? I mean, this isn't an area that's industrial. I mean, we have some churches in Houston, and we have a couple here that are industrial areas, and probably, or like you had the split down the road again. But, when you have a church and a community, a property, and is there an obligation to give our effort to maintain that?
Yeah. That's where a good map, a good real estate guy, a good civil engineer, and a good missiologist sit around a table and say, okay, which of these properties is really the footprint that's worth, preserving and going after. Because Pasadena, I mean, you can drive 100 feet in Pasadena and hit 2 churches. We helped a church close. This is several years ago now. They literally sold to the church next door. It was not a UBA church. They're a non-denominational Bible church. It was a great thing for the community. It was a great thing for Faith Central, something like that. But everybody won in that argument. Pasadena didn't lose, UBA didn't lose, nobody lost. It was hard for the church, but they knew at the time, and the building needed a ton of work. And so it was just kind of one of those things. Now I'll fight you to my dying breath for a couple of our churches in the Heights, because the dirt is worth millions of dollars, and no church will ever be able to replace that. No church planter is ever going into the Heights or Washington Avenue or Bel Air and being able to buy a church. It's just never going to happen. So it's certainly an argument worth having. And then, the cultural appropriateness of a language group. Like I said, we have several congregations that are sharing space and sharing it well. If you have a church that ministers mostly to older Anglos, I think that's appropriate as long as they understand if they're in a community that's predominantly Hispanic, their timeline is finite. If you are ministering to the predominant language group, your timeline is not finite, unless that group changes. So they should be in a space sharing agreement. They should also be the minority group. We've got one church that is Anglo in Pasadena. They've got 12 people in the sanctuary, and they got a Hispanic group that runs about 75 in the fellowship hall. That should be reversed, but the Anglo group owns the building. So that's baby steps toward that conversation.
Understand.
Now, one of your first comments was about discipleship as far as people in our church, being used of God. I mean, they see that that's their responsibility.
Gospel task.
Yeah, the gospel task. I'm working on my sermon for Sunday. Be holy as I am holy. And it doesn't mean necessarily be a person that doesn't do anything wrong, which I mean, that's a little bit of it. You're set aside to a purpose.
Yeah.
And people seeing that, I'm called to something great.
Yeah.
And that's the discipleship you're talking about there.
Yeah. The understanding. So that whole conviction is really born out of when we started forming Sending Pathways. We were asking the question of pastors, when you do an altar call, how many points of the altar call do? You call them to faith, you call them to baptism, you call them to membership. There used to be, the fourth, how many of you feel called to vocational Christian ministry, right? Almost nobody does that fourth point anymore, right? Even if you do an altar call, which I grew up Presbyterian, I can argue both ways on that. But I took some NAM personnel to the airport about 10 years ago when I was on staff, and he asked me, how many sermons have you ever heard where they're calling to vocational Christian ministry? And I said, maybe 2. And I thought the NAM guy was going to fall out of my car on the way to the airport. He was just flabbergasted. And I was like, you have to understand, almost everybody in my generation is going to give that same answer. That is just not a sermon that's given a lot anymore. And of course, he went on to bemoan my entire generation, and it was a whole thing. But as I talk to pastors, I get a whole variety of responses, and I could name for you stalwarts in generations older than mine who don't give that vocational call anymore. And they do it for a variety of reasons. One told me, I wouldn't know what to do with a guy if he walked forward. One guy told me, I only get the crazies. Okay. He said, I only get the guy that can't hold a job. So I don't want that guy anymore. If he can't hold a job at Chick-fil-A, I don't want to tell him how to be a career missionary, because he ain't going to be a career missionary. And so I got all kinds of responses. He goes, I want to be the guy who goes and taps a guy on the shoulder the way somebody tapped me on my shoulder. I don't want to be the guy who has to, deal with all the paperwork of crazy people coming down the aisle. And I just kind of laughed to myself, but I've had more than one person, and you would know their names, say, there aren't any people in my church who are called to plant churches or called to be missionaries or called to work with people groups, which I find utterly false, and recklessly irresponsible. So for a guy who was called out of a local church to tell me, who was called out of a local church, that there isn't anybody else in his congregation of more than 3,000 people, that there are no more church planters, missionaries, or diaspora people group missionaries in his church left, that's ridiculous. And so we wanted to say, okay, your church is no longer considered healthy unless you are raising up from within and sending out. Like, that's just our conviction. We could be wrong. I don't think we are, but that could be arrogance too. I just don't think we're wrong on that. So I don't know what God is calling you to. I'm just pretty convinced he's calling you to something. And it's our job to facilitate that calling and to help prepare you, and to do that in a collaborative way, right? Now, so now I'm talking about sending pathways. But, if we're going to help churches, say, encourage the calling out of missionaries, then we're, as an association, going to say, here's a way that these 2 or 3 churches can get together and train a cohort that is preparing for the mission field, and make the handoff to the IMB easier, because the handoff to IMB right now is not easy. And so we're making it easier. And we actually are. We're rolling out a cohort in the fall for potential missionaries to make that process seamless. If you feel like you're called to the pastorate, we're not going to say sign up for seminary and go forth and be married. We're going to actually train you and make that process better. It was brutal for me trying to suss out my own personal calling. We're going to help churches get together on that. And we're also going to help churches share their gifts. We have some great missionary sending churches that wouldn't know how to train a traditional pastor if one fell into their lap. And so we're going to say, you train the missionaries, you send out your traditional pastors or your diaspora missionaries or your church planters or replanters, you send them over here, and you guys that are great on church planting, you send your missionaries over here. And so that's why we're working that collaborative net. But yeah, that's a foundational principle for us right now. Sorry, that's off topic. You can edit that part.
No, it really isn't, because, the pathway, the equipping is foundational to that. Our strategy is planting, leadership, awakening, which is revitalization, and networking. The networking, of course, is the catch-all collaborative, kind of normal associational stuff. But you can't plant if you're not cultivating planters.
Right.
You can't help these churches revitalize or replant without a team. And so everything rests on that. Let me ask you about the buy-in on that, because one of the things I found here is my best churches with disciple making have tight ownership of their disciple making plan. And so, like, one of our struggling churches went to a neighboring larger church, and they asked, could you help us, send us some folks to help? And he said no, because in 30 days, those people will be where all your young families are. And they said, we had no young families. And he said, exactly. And he later told me, I would be willing to help them if we could merge with them, because I know the discipleship that they have engaged with that have helped brought them to that point. But, he's not willing to share it. Like, he's not ready to kick folks out of his network, not because he's worldly or not cooperative, but he knows what his commitment is and what he's done and what he's fruitful with. So I've got some churches with very strong. So how do you draw those guys to a broader vision that you can move toward what you guys are trying to do?
I don't know that I have a good answer for that, other than we're going to start small, but we're also starting with some marquee. So the IMB pipeline that we're working right now, which is our missionary sending pipeline pathway. I can't tell you yet. If I was a month from now, I could tell you the churches that'll be part of that pathway, but they're marquee churches. And just all cards on the table, it's going to create some peer pressure. Yeah. And peer pressure, when used positively, is a great thing. And so, it's going to be cool to be part of this. And we plan on leveraging the cool. And so, we're going to have one cohort with these 2 mega churches partnering on it, which will, I think, create some momentum for another cool cohort to start with some other mega churches. Not every church in UBA is going to do this, but it's not our intention to get everyone, because not everyone does really good missionary sending. Houston benefits from having Houston Church Planter Network. We're not going to do church planting cohorts. We're going to work with HCPN. Now, HCPN does not do certain types of planting, we will step into that niche and HCPN will work with us. And so what we're trying to do is really identify gaps in the existing system and draw people into those gaps. Now, when it comes to a situation like what you said, I don't know that there's a really good box around for that. Like, I have a good church. My best disciple making church in Houston gives their stuff away. Now they do it through conferences, and they say, you know, send your people here. If we need to scholarship them, we'll scholarship them, you know, whatever. But I give their name out like candy. And everybody who goes to their stuff comes back and says, man, that was life-changing. That was blown away. In fact, they said, you know, I don't need your number anymore. I've got his, you know. So that's great. You know, when I'm feeling great, and when I'm not feeling great, I hate that conversation. So, but you know, that's how it's supposed to work. And so I lift that up, and whenever I hear, and so I use, you know, all cards on the table inside baseball. When I hear a church go, well, I can't help them because of such and such, then I tell that story and go, hey, my best church gives their stuff away. And it's just if you're not threatened by that, if you see that the kingdom is really big enough to support, you know, if you believe the cattle on 1,000 hills versus and all of that stuff, then that's the way you'll act. Now, the other thing is too, like, I get requests all the time for if a church would just send us 10 couples, you know, or 3 young people to work in our thing, then we would have a massive turnaround. I don't swing at that pitch very often, right? Because it's very rarely true. Now, sometimes I take that as an opportunity to say, well, let's talk about a revitalization process. Let's talk about what that would really mean, because I can get churches involved in a revitalization process if we're at the table, as opposed to a people barter, which I don't get involved in at all. I'm very picky about what I stake my and UVA's reputation on. And because I have a pretty good reputation among our mega churches, unless they're watching and they disagree with me, that, you know, I think they are more likely to swing at a pitch if I'm likely to swing at a pitch. So, and they've granted me grace when I've been wrong, but for the most part, I think that's true.
So are you saying that normally doesn't work?
The sending the people?
Yeah.
No, I'm not saying that. I'm saying that in isolation doesn't work. You know, like if you have a struggling church and they say, man, if we just had 10 young people working in our nursery, then everything would be better.
Right.
In a vacuum, not knowing any other facts, I'm going to tell you that that's probably not going to work. If that's
change,
if that's part of a larger process and they've done some other things, then yes. Now, I mean, because church plants do that all the time, right? Church plants starting to say, man, we can't mingle with anybody who's visiting because we're all doing the essential functions. Well, then you bring other people in to do the essential functions so that they can, you know, witness or greet or whatever, and, you know, conduct life as a normal church. That works all the time, you know, and then eventually you have people to do the essential functions. But I mean, I've seen struggling churches all the time just say, if we just had a couple of college students, we'd be great. And that's not true. So,
yeah. Mm-hmm. Now, with as far as multicultural churches, most of the time we're talking a big church, multicultural. And when you're starting a church, you nearly have to focus on, okay, you know, this culture wants to somewhat, you know, it'd be a Hispanic church, or to be an Anglo church, or to be an Asian church. Somewhat. What I'm thinking.
I don't know. Everything depends on the context and the demographics. So I'm a big context guy. And I don't know that you have to be a big church to be multicultural. Multicultural and multi-ethnic are different. And so if you're talking about ethnicity, you probably do have to be sizable to be multi-ethnic. If each ethnicity is going to be represented and get what they need from that you're going to be multicultural almost de facto, depending on where you land. But multi-ethnic, you tend to stray into different languages and that kind of thing. And so, so I don't know. Do you have a particular question about how? I mean, are you asking a size question, or are you asking a starting out question?
No, just hearing the stories you were telling of, well, this one, ethnicity, what I'm talking about, I suppose. But it's been kind of the flag that's been waved that, hey, we all need to be multicultural. Well, yeah, that's great in a lot of ways, but that's not how, I mean, you've got to deal with people where they're at too.
Totally.
So,
yeah, no, in fact, every year I get an opportunity to speak to the Houston Church Planter Network residents, which are the guys coming through. And I tell them, I understand that it's the cool thing to say that we're going to plant a multicultural church and a multi-ethnic church, like all the multis, right? But here's the thing, if your community demographics do not support that, then stop saying that. Like I live in Friendswood, which is like 80% Anglo. If you come down here and say that you want to plant a multicultural church and you want to grab, the 20% of other, then that's fine. But own the demographics. Like if you're going to be in Bel Air, you should be, Bel Air. If you're going to be in Sugarland, you should be Sugarland. If you're going to be in Kingwood, you're going to be Anglo. I mean, that's just the way it is. So if you're going to be in Pasadena, you should be Hispanic in some way, shape, or form. Okay, just know the demographics and be who you are. And then people always want to argue about, people are driving in and we get a little bit of everybody, and that's fine. But own your context is what I always say. If the context demands multicultural, multi-ethnic approach, then be that. If it doesn't demand that, then don't force it either. But God's going to give you people to reach them, and don't reach who you think you should reach while ignoring the people that are right in front of you.
One of the things we experienced when we were planting churches in Nebraska, Josh, was we would launch a church with a vision based on one assessment of the community, but the door that was open in those initial ministry engagements led to a completely different format for the church. In Chadron, Nebraska, we expected to reach local, and the floodgates to the college campus opened up. And before you knew it, we had a core group of a collegiate church, faculty members there, and the plant took a whole different direction than the original strategy, which opened the door for another church plant, which was wonderful. But that's where your context and where you're doing ministry, would we plant a church and not think, how are we going to reach the people around us? I don't think so.
Yeah, I can't imagine a circumstance where you plant a church ignoring the context. Like, to me, that seems extremely dangerous. That, in fact, almost every replant revitalization congregation I've ever seen, their membership map is all over the place. I don't know how you purport to do community ministry with that. I don't know why you would start that. I understand how churches get there, but I don't know why you would start with that in mind. Well, let me just say, maybe the one exception to that would be a people group who is so spread out that they start with a commuter model in mind because they start with a regional mindset. But that's an extremely low percentage, model. But I could see that being appropriate. If we were going to plant among Somalis in Houston, we would put them in a particular location, but we would probably draw 30 miles in any one direction. But that's a people group model. Nobody else is going to do that.
Very good.